Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the Columbia University Leadership Series. Today, I'm really delighted that we are bringing together two deans, both world-renowned experts in their fields, for an in-depth analysis and discussion of topics that are of current global interest. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia, and I'm also a senior research scholar at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. With me to address the present and future of health and policy is Mary Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and Linda Fried, Dean of the Mailman School of Public Health. Vice Provost Julie Kornfeld will help moderate both the discussion and the student questions. Before I turn to our esteemed guests, a couple of quick words about the Columbia Global Centers. The Global Centers are located in 9 countries around the world, with another 9 pop-up locations serving as study and convening spaces for Columbia's international students during the pandemic. We are Columbia's physical and intellectual global infrastructure, facilitating knowledge exchange, research collaborations, and education programs to advance our understanding of and engagement with the world. Now to Professor Mary Janow, Dean of the Columbia School of International Public Affairs since 2013. The school was founded in 1946 in the aftermath of the Second World War, with an emphasis on practical training and fostering understanding of geographic regions of vital interest. The students become diplomats, public officials, and leaders who can meet the needs of our increasingly complex world. The result is a national and international reputation as a leading center for education and research programs in area studies, security, and international relations. This year, CEPA was ranked again as the #1 international global policy school by US News and World Report in its 2021 Best Graduate Schools ranking. Dean Janow herself is as formidable as the school she leads. As Dean, she has strengthened the school by launching new programs and initiatives in the areas of technology and public policy with a focus on cybersecurity and the digital economy, entrepreneurship and policy, and central banking and financial policy. She also has grown CEPA's faculty and supported the creation of new research centers. Dean Janow is a globally recognized expert in international trade and investment with extensive experience in academia, government, and business. She has been deeply involved with the Asia Pacific region for her entire career. For the past 25 years, Dean Janow has been a professor at both the School of International Public Affairs and at Columbia Law School. She teaches graduate courses on the digital economy, comparative antitrust law, and China in the global economy. She has authored 3 books, including the WTO, Governance, Dispute Settlement, and Developing Countries, in addition to numerous scholarly articles. Professor Janow has had 3 stints of government service. In December 2003, while at Columbia, she was elected as one of the 7 members of the World Trade Organization's appellate body. From 1997 to 2000, she served as the executive director of the first International Antitrust Advisory Committee to the Attorney General for Antitrust of the US Justice Department. And from 1989 to 1993, prior to joining Columbia, Dean Janow served as Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative for Japan and China in the Executive Office of the President. Welcome, Merit. Our next panelist is Linda Fried, Dean of the Mailman School of Public Health. The school is one of the original schools of public health in the US, about to celebrate its centennial. And it has, for the past century, been an international thought leader, addressing critical public health issues and opportunities for preventing ill health, ranging from emerging infectious diseases and preventing pandemics to urban health disparities and the impact of climate change on health, to the implications of health policy decisions. The Mailman School is committed to creating knowledge, translating science for impact, and educating the next generation of public health leaders. Dean Fried is an internationally renowned leader in the fields of public health, geriatric medicine, and epidemiology. Prior to becoming dean in 2008, She directed Johns Hopkins Division of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology and the Center of Scientific Excellence on Aging and Health. The author of over 500 scientific articles and leader of major longitudinal cohort studies and randomized trials to establish scientific basis for health longevity, Dr. Fried was recognized by Thomson Reuters as among the top 1% most influential scientific minds of the last decade, and in 2012 by the New York Times as one of 15 world leaders in science. She's the recipient of both the French National INSERM International Prize in Medical Research and the Association of American Physicians Kober Medal. Dean Fried is an elected member of the US National Academy of Medicine and currently serves as re-elected member of the Executive Council. She was elected to the Association of American Physicians in 2000 and served as its president for 2 years. Dean Fried was member of the Council of the National Institute on Aging and has served from 2006 to the present as a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Aging and its current Council on Longevity. Finally, to help with questions and with the discussion, I would like to introduce my colleague, Julie Kornfeld, Vice President for Academic Programs. As Vice Provost, Professor Kornfeld oversees the university's broad range of academic programs with a focus on compliance, policy, and regulatory requirements. She is charged with facilitating partnerships with US and foreign universities, managing the university's accreditation, coordinating academic reviews of schools and other units, and advancing interdisciplinary initiatives. As a scholar, Professor Kornfeld focuses on public health education and teaches in the core curriculum at the Mailman School of Public Health, where she was previously Vice Dean for Education and has been an Associate Professor of Epidemiology since 2016. Merit, Linda, Julie, welcome to our audience members, our students all over the world, welcome. So to start our discussion, I'd like to pose a question to both of you, Merit and Linda, if you don't mind. History suggests that major crises such as wars, natural disasters, and pandemics serve as a call for action and a chance to think boldly. From each of your perspectives, what is needed from public policy and public health to think beyond the tragedy and the missteps of the COVID-19 pandemic and move us forward? Dean Janow, would you like to start with that, please?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for, first of all, thank you, Safwan, and all of your team for creating an extraordinary, vibrant network of global centers and using those during this period in such an important way for us to engage with our students all over the world, and also let us to continue to engage the world, which is so important to us institutionally. So really congratulations. And thank you for that overly generous introduction. It's a privilege to be here with you, Julie and Linda. Let me just throw out a few observations. And I do feel that, if you look at history, there are periods in history when the world experiences shocks, and in their aftermath, things change. In the aftermath of the Second World War, sometimes it can lead to the creation of new institutions, recognizing the horrors of war, recognizing the interconnectedness of the world. And certainly the Bretton Woods institutions created in the aftermath of the Second World War was an effort, to promote global growth and early architecture of some degrees of global economic governance. But sometimes also shocks cause countries to turn inwards, and nationalism and populism can rise. And so it's not clear to me yet what is going to come out of this period. I think you're going to see some of both. I don't believe globalization is going to stop. I think there are many features which continue. I think we're all very conscious of how there's been an acceleration of the digital economy, and some parts have really moved very quickly during this period and will continue. But you're also seeing a lot of strains within societies, strains that originated well before this pandemic, some of which have been, I think, exacerbated, continued by the conditions that have occurred. So I think we're in a moment to seize, and so the challenge is, can we seize it? What's possible? I think maybe we'll talk about this later. One of the most challenging issues I feel for the United States is whether we're going to be able to heal this country politically to bring us more closely together. It's an enormous question, and I cannot currently conceive exactly how to do it. It takes a willingness to look across the aisle for shared purpose in a period when there's more divisiveness than I think in our history. Um, what's driving this? A part of it, I think many speak to, is inequality, which has some very unique American features and which has been very much accentuated in recent years. But is it fixable? I'm an optimist, and I think if you work with young people, as we do, and you see the enormous talent and drive that we're exposed to all over the world, I think we have to be optimistic. And I think economic recovery and vitalization can change the sense of possibilities. And thus, it is the right thing to be focusing now on recovery and the steps that each economy and country can take on economic growth, on infrastructure, on climate. These are the right essential steps. And I think in aggregate growth terms, our economy may come back strongly and global growth can resume. The measures that have just been passed in the United States and others that are under design are aimed at providing relief to households and getting the economy back on track. And, OECD data are suggesting that global prospects for growth have really improved. And I'm hearing a lot of economists say that by the beginning of next year, the aggregate indicators will say that we won't even have see a pandemic having happened. But I think, frankly, that's going to be an uneven story around the world, and that's really important to focus on. Because many developing and emerging countries have far fewer levers they can utilize to get back on growth. And fundamentally, what happens to the virus and the management of it is going to be so crucial. So there's, to me, just an inescapable urgency to focus now on the vaccine rollout in the United States and globally. And never in my lifetime have I felt that health policy was economic policy the way it is today. So I'm can't wait to hear what Dean Fried says about how the world may be able to cope with this, because that, I think, is going to determine, particularly in the developing world, what happens globally.
Thank you, Merit. And it's really wonderful to hear the positive outlook and the hope for economic growth. We'll come back to that and talk about how it intersects with policy. And to the issue of public health and economic health, Linda, you led a webinar with the Global Centers not too long ago on the false choice between economic health and public health. So would love to hear your perspective, Dean Fried, on all of these issues and from a public health perspective. And let me also bring into it a question that's already been posted by Dina Mufti on what investments are required to treat, in the treatment of COVID-19. And I think what she means by that is the overall uh, treatment of the pandemic and getting out of it, and how do we deal with equitable access. So over to you, Neerpreet.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. I'm honored to follow Merit, always somebody I learn from. And Safwan, thank you for your leadership, and Julie, thank you. And most of all, I want to say how what a privilege it is to be here. I think Columbia University as a whole has really enacted during this pandemic in very deep and profound ways what we recognize to be the responsibility of great research universities to try and bring knowledge to solutions for society. And so I thank all of you. In your question, Safwan, about how to think whether we need bold action and what it might be going forward coming out of this pandemic, I think the obvious thing is that first we need to make sure we learn the lessons of the pandemic. And Merit already started out in that path by saying that we've learned deeply in broad and deep ways that health and the economy are not separable. And we've also learned that it's very easy to distract the scapegoats, whether you're scapegoating countries or segments of the population. But if we look at the core lessons of what we've learned, there are a number, and I think it's critical to recognize them in order to think about what kind of bold approaches are needed going forward, both to finish containing this pandemic and to prevent the next one, because there will be more. One is, I think we have all learned together that health matters. It's not just inseparable from the economy, but it's a precondition for human flourishing as well as economic flourishing. And we also have learned that the underlying health of a population affects the outcomes in a pandemic. Certainly in the US, we have seen this in great relief, which is that those with pre-existing ill health and those with less access to care are most at risk. And so how we go into a pandemic determines how we do in it and how we come out of it. And I think that points us to directions for bold action for the future. The other is, quite frankly, related to that inequities in health worsen economic disparities and economic and personal futures. The second thing we've learned, perhaps inadequately, is that science offers us approaches to the difficult and often complex and unfathomable. In this case, I think particularly public health science and expertise offers effective approaches to preventing the spread of a novel and highly infectious virus. But we also learned that science and knowledge alone are not sufficient. We have to have political leaders who can align with knowledge and lead to build public unity for shared purpose. And in the absence of that, science alone is not sufficient. And in the middle of that, one leadership approach which I really admire in this pandemic, of course, comes from South Africa, whose response to a pandemic where we needed to affect not social distancing, but physical distancing between people to decrease spread. The motto was physical distancing, but social solidarity will conquer this virus. And in fact, those two things together are critical. One requires political leadership and one requires scientific leadership in putting them together. And we need, actually, certainly in the US, I think what we've revealed is that we have disinvested for too long in our public health system. Public health defined as the science-based actions that we must take collectively to protect the health of the public, requires the ability to deliver the goods. And if a country disinvests in the capabilities for prevention for too long, you end up with a population that's sicker to start with and without the capabilities to rise to the moment in a crisis. I would say we've learned some other things about leadership and how leadership and science need to align. One of the challenges of a pandemic is that one single action won't do it. Even just a vaccine is not sufficient. And human beings are deeply better at either or decisions. Either I wear a mask or I don't. Either I'm in or I'm out. But in fact, the solutions to a pandemic and many other things are both and solutions. Let's get back to work in the ways we can while protecting safety. How can we get leadership that will help us not choose, but establish what the South Africans decided as social solidarity? Yeah, the other thing that the pandemic has highlighted is that we are not the same population as we were 100 years ago in the pandemic of 1918. So in 1918, as the pandemic went around the world twice and then 3 times, the people who died the most were young people, particularly people living in group settings like military barracks. This time around, the people most at risk were populations we didn't have in 1918. People who were living to older age, which is happening globally. We've added almost 30 years to human life expectancy in the last 100 years, and that is continuing happily as a result of investments in human flourishing. And we have a dominant health problem that didn't exist in 1918, which was underlying chronic conditions. And we need to lead to, in a very different way for this and all the subsequent pandemics, to protect people's lives under those conditions. We also have environments that didn't exist in 1918. Air pollution, global warming, both of these have had a role in this pandemic. And quite frankly, I don't think our policies have evolved for these new realities. And finally, we've been confronted with the recognition that globally health conditions don't stay within borders. There are other things we're confronted with that don't stay within borders, like climate change. And we're going to need a new level of mutual commitment to solve problems that affect us within borders, but can't be turned around just within borders. So with those observations, and of course there are many more, I would say that we have to actually align leadership and science to be successful going forward. We need leadership that can help us come together, just as Mayor Janow was just saying, for other reasons. That can help us shape a social compact where we realize what matches deeply felt human needs, that we're all in this one together, that there are some problems that can be solved individually, but some problems require collective action, that we need public goods like public health, the investments we make collectively to protect all of our health and lives. And we need to make it stronger and stronger because the threats to our health and well-being in the future are more and more going to need public health leadership. And finally, that we need to build back for the circumstances of the 21st century, longer lives, more chronic disease, compromised environments. All of these are contributing to what we know will happen, which is more and more pandemics. And so we need to build back for policies that unite us, as Dean Janow said, but also that can stay the course, because this is not a one and done situation. This is a new world that whose vulnerabilities have been exposed, and we need to build back using knowledge and science combined with leadership for the public good.
I'm going to jump. Yeah, I
Julie,
was
go
going
ahead.
to jump in and ask you both, Dean Janow and Dean Fried mentioned quite a bit leadership. I think both scientific leadership and political leadership. I think one thing that this pandemic has shown is that when science is not understood or respected by the public, we find people have difficulty taking action, both for their own health and for their communities. And I think one of the things that you both mentioned, but I'd love to hear a little more about, is just, how do we increase scientific literacy? How do we increase political literacy so people better understand how these two things come together as we go forward? And I wonder if you might comment on those things that I know you've thought deeply about. Maybe Dean Fried, I'll jump to you first.
So I wish I knew all the answers, Julie. I don't, but I do know that we need to hold our leaders accountable to lead based on knowledge. That's really critical. And they have a critical role in educating people, even if they didn't learn something in school, as to what's in our collective and individual best interest and why they're making the recommendations that they're making, so that we can line up together with them. Leaders have educational roles, whether they're scientific leaders or political leaders. And the more we can demand and expect that they line up together, I think the better.
So let me take that and ask you, Meredith, how do you do that in a way that ensures greater international engagement? Building off your vast experience on multilateral cooperation in trade and economy, how do you apply it in this field of public policy, public health, the leadership that Linda spoke about that is needed, the need to build back for policies that can stay the course and protect us against future pandemics? How do we ensure that that happens through international engagement and multilateral cooperation? You need to unmute, Merit.
Interesting. I did not mute myself. Thank you. Very important, hard questions to answer. So I think we are in a period, for a long time, but acutely now, when the difference between domestic and international have blurred so profoundly. I think what happens in one country, has international consequences. We've seen that, profoundly with the spread of the pandemic, but so too do economic measures and much more broadly. So the distinction between domestic and international is very great. There has been, I think, some backlash against globalization for a variety of reasons. A view and a fear that imports have resulted in loss of jobs and diminished futures. In fact, a combination of things have come together to, I think, alter in advanced countries, including technological change, for example. So I think, people need to feel that their futures have promise, right? I think that's fundamental, that sense of human flourishing. Without that, thinking about, global responses and so on feels very abstract and very distant if you feel your own future is diminished. I think in terms of what I would say a driver of global growth has been international trade. And, I think it's in the post-war period, open borders have really lifted people out of poverty around the world. It have accelerated growth in the United States and globally. You've seen many countries narrow the gap between rich and poor. And at this moment, you're seeing these hard-won gains have been profoundly affected in the poor countries. The World Bank and the IMF have just come out with new data saying that more than 150 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty because of COVID and its consequences, kind of ending a 30-year positive trend that we've been seeing, with especially hard-hit effects, of course, in Africa and South Asia. And so, what's going to get us out of this? Part of what will make a difference is keeping our borders open and allowing for international trade. And it's not just for the poorest countries. I was hearing a discussion around some pharmaceutical executives the other day who were arguing that, for example, Pfizer, their vaccine has 280 components that are manufactured in 19 different countries. And so that's their supply chain. And so if you see a blockage in that supply chain, it's going to really affect the ability to scale production. And that, coupled with export restrictions, is going to make it very difficult. Now, countries may need to make choices in the near term to vaccinate their domestic populations, but keeping that global trading system open so we can develop responses and promote global growth, I think is one of the things that we have to keep talking about as we go into this period. Now, and so I think that's a leadership challenge, and it's a leadership challenge that will need to be explained why this matters, to all of our populations, even as we think harder about our changing global system, as we think harder about the very real geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. That I think increasingly have a technology dimension to it and will also affect choices countries make around the openness of our countries in some segments. So I think I don't have an answer to how you fix it, but I think it's clear that certain things will only send us down into a darker path. And to my way of thinking, trade restrictions that are not carefully designed and architected for the world of integration that we actually live in would be disastrous, and we have to keep our eye on keeping that open.
Thank you, Merit. Very, very important to note. So we have a student, Gabriel Pomerantz, who is in Great Neck, New York. Hi, Gabriel. And you're graduating next month, we hope, right? With a master's in health administration, if I'm not mistaken. So please pose your question to the deans.
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Masri, and thank you to everyone for a lovely discussion. My question focuses on the employer's perspective, as employers are the ultimate payers behind managed healthcare plans. In April 2020, the Northeast Business Group on Health led an employer coalition called the Path Forward for Mental Health and Substance Use, representing New York City, Long Island, and Westchester County, to help improve behavioral healthcare access for individuals with employer-sponsored insurance. Unfortunately, many providers still are unwilling to take insurance because reimbursement has been so weak. My question is, what types of reforms do you believe are required in order for employers to be able to push managed healthcare companies to increase behavioral healthcare access for employees, especially so that independent practitioners open up their panels?
Great question.
I guess I should take that first.
And only.
So I think you touched on a number of very critical points, but one that you touched on is the hesitancy of employers and insurers to invest in behavioral health and preventive health in general. And that resistance has to do with the time course to return on investment. I think it's one of the many reasons why strengthened public health matters, because how we actually lead to create the conditions generally outside of the workplace and in the workplace, the conditions that make healthy choices the easy options, that make health the easy default for everybody, is what we need to tackle right now as we come out of this pandemic, so that we create conditions in which people, the whole population, is healthier. We do need employers to understand that the return on investment from prevention is huge. It's much higher actually than medical care at a group level. And part of the return on investment is on health, and part of the return on investment in prevention, which behavioral health management is about, is on productivity of the workforce. But it requires a mentality of investing in the future as well as the present, even if the person who's healthier in 10 years isn't still working for you.
Great. Merit?
You know, this is not my area, so I think I can't add anything useful.
Okay. Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you. So, Merit, let me turn to you again on the politics of it all. I mean, you referred to that in your opening remarks, politics and policy. We have hopefully come out of a very dangerous period of very intense and active partisan politics in the United States. But if we think of the US and you think of the world more broadly, and we, with hyper nationalistic tendencies that we have been seeing, you talked about the importance of opening borders. Where do you see, and what lessons have we learned actually in terms of governance structures? Do you see hope in coming out of this in terms of how, let's start with the United States, for example, political influence, partisan politics, sort of, taking a back seat perhaps to the importance of what needs to be accomplished?
Look, if you're going to be politically engaged, you need to be an optimist. You need to be resilient. You need to keep trying. I'm very proud that recently we've had a number of SEPA graduates be elected to Congress. They're filled with ideas and experience and perspective, so look, you need to be an optimist if you're going to engage the policy process, because nothing happens quickly and nothing happens without compromises. But this is just an inescapably partisan, intensely partisan period in the United States. I think that it is, there's some green shoots you can see now with some of the big packages that are being designed. I think infrastructure is an area, for example, where Republicans and Democrats can agree that it's important to foster economic growth to create the kind of jobs. As you've seen, there was a very significant partisan divide around climate. But there may not be as much of a divide around innovation and the importance of investing in certain areas of R&D and technology. So I think it's going to be a very difficult few years, but I also think that the magnitude of the measures that are now currently being designed in the United States hold some promise, both for supporting economic growth and fashioning some basis for cooperation, hopefully at home. But I think it's just a period where very few leaders are reaching across the aisle domestically. The president is saying that, and that's really important. But very few Democrats or Republicans, are able to execute on that in a way that is driving a cohort with them. Let's hope it happens. And, someone said to me once years ago when I was working in Washington, coalitions are formed legislation by legislation. And so as these bills are being designed, maybe those will create opportunities for new beginnings along these lines. We have a lot of new members in Congress. Perhaps those will create opportunities. Also, governors are very practical people, right? And that I think there's promise in that. And sometimes mayors are very practical people too. So you see coalitions being formed around problem solving, by governors and by mayors. So I say, don't just look to Washington by any means to say, where will solutions emanate? They'll emanate locally. They'll emanate, across states. And more, the private sector is a partner to these solutions. I think that's part of the reason why, so many of our graduates are going both into the public sector, but also into the private sector, because they want to have that sense of public purpose infusing what they're doing. This movement that you're now seeing around ESG, for example, environmental, social, and governance issues that's, reflected around climate, powerfully around climate, but also around, I think, gender equality, around race issues, and a host of other issues, are individuals expressing themselves as shareholders and corporations feeling that they have a responsibility and under pressure to do so, and reinforced by public policy. So I think you have to look for drivers of change in many places in society. And when you look at that, coupled with what I think of, I'm not a techno-utopian, but I do think technology is an enhancer and has tremendous potential and can make a great contribution if properly framed.
Safwan, if I could add, I think that one of the big opportunities of this moment, with the economies of so many countries having been diminished, if not even shut down, is the chance to actually take a step back and do a major reset for the future that wouldn't have been possible perhaps otherwise. And that is building on Dean Janow's comment about green shoots, to say, can we build back an economy that is fit for purpose for the 21st century? We can do it in ways that actually build infrastructure for a sustainable world, but also for health. We can design for human well-being. We can make investments in the industries and the infrastructure that will set the stage for a better future, and while protecting against one major issue that is going to threaten our collective well-being, namely climate change, can also mitigate future pandemics. This is a moment where investment in the right things for the long-term future is possible. And it's a cause for me for excitement and optimism if we do it. One of the things we didn't mention is that we've reaped a long-term investment in this pandemic, which is vaccines. So that was a product not of a push of 20 minutes or of 20 weeks, but of 20 years of investing in the US, but also globally, global organizations investing in the science that could lead to vaccines when they're needed. Those kinds of long-term investments for the right things are the bold actions we need right now to reset for a different future than we had in the 20th century, and to make it work for everybody. and we have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really agree with that. And I think there's tremendous thinking along those lines happening at Columbia University, which is also, very exciting, whether it's in the sciences or related to climate, or even around areas like multilateral institutions. I think, these institutions, the bank and the fund, are trying to play their part. Others, like the World Trade Organization, have been, I think, paralyzed by lack of consensus among 164 very different countries. Uh, but it's a moment when I think we have to ask ourselves, if these institutions are going to play in the role in the future, something has to happen now. And so it is a moment, I think, not for a huge new multilateral round, because there's no international agreement for that, but for moving things forward where you can. And I think there's spirit in the world to do that, at least among clusters of countries that the US could seize and engage if it's prepared to do so.
Yeah. No, that's, I mean, I loved hearing everything that both of you said about this, and the fact that it has to happen at multiple levels, right? At the country level, at the regional level, but also what you said, Merit, about the city and the state level, right? So cooperation that happens at those levels is really, really important. And we have seen all over the world trust in local governments that sometimes is greater than trust in the broader federalist types of governments. And on international cooperation, I mean, as soon as Pfizer BioNTech announced their vaccine, um, it did not go unnoticed that this is a German American collaboration, a German company that's led by a Turkish couple, and an American company that's led by a Greek CEO. I mean, where it defies sort of a lot of the perceptions that might otherwise exist, or the barriers that might exist. Let's turn now to another student, Mareba Fawad, who is joining us from Oklahoma. Mareba, can we turn the camera on? Okay. And Mareba is, hi, and you're a Master's in Public Health candidate.
Yes.
Is part of the class of 2022. So please go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much, Professor Masri, and hello both Dean Janow and Dean Fried and Julie. So my question is, since last April, the French government has had very robust incremental community-based exit strategies to lift lockdowns region by region. So how could policy in America help us implement COVID exit strategies such as this for the sake of public health without coming across as overly paternalistic, which is a fear of many US citizens with widespread policy solutions?
I guess I'll start that, and thank you for a really important question, but I'm sure that Dean Janow has a lot to add. So this is where maybe we can go full circle. This is where science and leadership have to unite, right? We know what needs to be done from a scientific basis to end this pandemic, but it requires leadership that changes the conversation. From paternalism and being told what to do to recognizing that no one in a pandemic is in it by themselves. Even if we do nothing, we affect each other. In fact, we've done that quite grandly in this pandemic in the spread of disease, out of control in many situations. So in a pandemic, we're not independent. We can't just legislate our personal immunity and go on. We actually affect each other's health. And therefore, and the only way we shut this down is by accepting that we have shared responsibility to contribute to the solution. That's a different message than paternalism, and I think it holds for many things that we're confronted with in a highly interconnected world. That we need leadership to say we can't solve a pandemic going it one person at a time and alone, that we have deep interconnections with people we love, with our family, in our communities, and we have therefore a solution that requires shared responsibility. And we need to help people learn how, all of us, how to keep going while wearing a mask. You know, you can do most things in life wearing a mask. It doesn't end your ability to think, talk, or get things done, but we have to learn with leadership modeling how to keep going in the face of conditions that we didn't want and didn't create, but can actually, by coming together, model how to solve it.
Yeah, I would just, I was going to start where Dean Fried ended, which is the importance of modeling, the importance of leaders, not denying evidence and speaking to that. It just makes a tremendous difference. And those have to be local leaders also. There's tremendous suspicion in some parts of the country that the government is not just being paternalistic, but is being intrusive. And, you know, we stand for a country of individual freedom, and government can't tell me what to do. And, you know, I've heard all sorts of thoughtful, educated people say, you know, this is being exaggerated. This is just a bad flu. I can't believe those conversations, but they still happen. And so you have to come in with the data, with the evidence, with the leadership, and they have to model the kind of behavior you think is important. But also recognize that, you know, people have anxieties. There are communities that have had very bad experiences. That, you know, we have to overcome those in a very thoughtful way. We have to make extra efforts. So this is a multi-year, multi-dimensional, very, very hard problem. And it also speaks to a system that needs to tolerate a degree of heterogeneity, right? We're not going to have uniformity in our country in the way that you're going to see in smaller, more homogeneous populations or authoritarian systems. It's just not going to be.
Yeah, yeah. So we have another on-camera question that is from Yifan Li, who's in Beijing, and he is a CEPA student. Hi, Yifan. Yifan has also been a volunteer helping us coordinate our efforts for students throughout China. So Yifan, please.
Hi, thank you for a great discussion. My name is Yifan. I'm a first-year MPA student from China. I'm currently taking online classes at Beijing. I think after the pandemic, the Chinese government played a leading role in developing China's public health resource by bulk purchasing public health equipment for local hospital and creating new public health initiative and higher education institute. So my question is, which sectors should play a dominant role in the future of public health? The private sector, the public sector, or the public-private partnership? And maybe a general question like how the government public policy could shape the future of public health. Thank you.
So shall I start? So I think one of the basic points about public health is the definition that these are the actions we must take collectively to create the health of a population. And by definition, I think we've learned a number of things, one of which is that health is malleable. That's a knowledge of the last century. We didn't know that before, that actions can actually protect everybody's health and raise the level of health for everyone. And that, by definition, it meets the definition of a public good. So public goods are the things that we invest in together, where everybody gains. No one is left out or loses. And, like with clean air, if you get to breathe clean air, I don't get less of it. I get it too. And those are roles for government to enact public goods. But in this era, we cannot do it just within one sector. It has to be a public-private citizen partnership to actually create the will and the actions across sectors to affect health. And so it is a joint responsibility, which I believe in the definition of public goods requires governmental leadership. Mara?
Thank you. I agree with that completely. I'm hoping to have a moment in life when I can reflect on the lessons of this period and draw those longer term implications. So, I have a sense that in the United States, very unique measures were taken to accelerate the vaccine production and authorization, for example. So that was a policy intervention that allowed emergency measures to accelerate deployment. And there may be lessons for that for the future. But a lot of that innovation was occurring in the private sector. And now that we're in, just crucially, and as Dean Fried said, built on decades of scientific work. And now that we're in a period when it's just essential to roll out these vaccines, we're learning again how to do this in this country. And it requires triggering different entities, for it to be effective than it will in China, for example. So I think countries are going to have to mobilize the most efficient parts of their system and improve other parts. And it will be a combination that will lead us down the path of effective implementation. And I think it's not a one size fits all in today's world.
I would also add that, when you think about public goods and moments like this, it reminds us why human beings come together to form governments, which is to enact the things that we cannot enact alone that create human flourishing. And that's an altruistic definition of the role of government, but it is the core motivation to have it.
So we have time for one more question. And Julie, why don't you take...
I'm going to maybe merge a few questions that I'm seeing in the chat here. There's a feeling, I guess, a question of, how do we, obviously within the schools of public health and the School of Public Policy, we're educating kind of the next change agents, if you will, who are going out to lead the transformational change that we'll need in public health and policy. But how do we advance maybe broader education, mass education, if you will, around political and science literacy so that we can kind of raise the floor, something I know I've heard Dean Fried speak about, so that we can, really engage broader population around the efforts that need to happen in terms of our own education around health and the political process. So perhaps commenting on that and even what role the students can play in their own communities towards that end.
So Julie, I can't help turning this back to you as a master educator and asking you that question.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think one of the important things is that we do a very good job, I think, as you all have spoken about, in terms of generating new knowledge and new science. And I think one of the questions we all have to ask ourselves is, how do we do this and how do we translate that knowledge in a better way to communities? And I think we've learned very much in this pandemic that one size does not fit all, that what message works for one community does not work for another. And I think, Dean Janow, you alluded to the fact that many people have different lenses by which they view their experience experiences with government, with science, and with political leaders. And often that communication happens best at the local level. And I think one message I would say to our students who are lucky enough to engage here at Columbia in the scientific conversations and political debate is to think about who you can partner with in the community, and look at younger children and younger, we need a pipeline of young scientists and young political leaders, and engage in that conversation with them so that we can disseminate more broadly the knowledge I think we're generating within the university to our communities. And keeping in mind that one size does not fit all, and that we really need to customize those messages and seek input on what those messages should really say, because the communities know how to communicate best to one another, and we need to partner with them. So that's my answer.
I say here, here. I agree.
I concur. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful time together. And let me say, I completely agree with Linda. It's been an extraordinary period for Columbia University. I've never been prouder of our schools of public health and medicine and the way that we've come together as a university.
And to that, I will say here, here. And I think this is a beautiful example of this. And thank you so much for participating in this really global classroom. I've learned so much listening to you, and I know that our students and other members of our global audience have as well. So thank you for sharing so much. And thank you, Julie, for leading this series and for all your efforts. And thank you, Linda, and thank you, Merit. And thanks to, bye, thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye.